You got it. That makes for a good day. Okay. No, I think it's see, that was something, it's out here.
Oh. Yeah, I saw her at the grocery store.
That's what she's saying.
Yes. Yes. Are y'all still meeting?
I hope you're feeling better today.
I was feeling much better, thank you.
I'm good.
Steady.
I knew you were a little better soon.
And how's
I
the
was.
His magic.
Okay.
And so her daughter, my daddy's daughter, that's where they lives in. We said it before.
Yeah.
So she could group.
That just about fixes everything.
And then when he picked her up,
What was your job?
you know.
I work in buildings and
And
grounds.
she has a really
Assistant
And,
superintendent.
Nancy.
It's just a big job.
He was one that did all the work.
She's here.
I don't know about that.
Yes.
He had the big well, made everybody work.
I didn't have any problem with it. You know, when I asked them to do something, they would do it. And, we were over at.
Good morning.
Good morning. Morning.
Thanks for coming out on such a rainy, drizzly day, but as I was reminded, I thank Cooper reminded me, we like to see the rain and we see all the rest of the country dealing with blizzards and snowstorms and ice and hazardous conditions. So we pray for those in need of protection. And I wanted to open today with one of my favorite collects. As we celebrated the election of a new bishop for Alabama, and in the ordination services there is a collect for the church, and so I wanted to open with that collect. If I can find it here, in the section on ordinations, new ministry, consecration of the church, ordinations. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. O God of unchangeable power and eternal light, look favorably on your whole church, that wonderful and sacred mystery. By the effectual working of your providence, carry out in tranquility the plan of salvation. Let the whole world see and know that things which were cast down are being raised up, and things which had grown old are being made new, and that all things are being brought to their perfection by him through whom all things were made, your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. A wonderful prayer that speaks about the mission of the church, that we are in partnership with Christ, the providence of salvation. Work out with tranquility the plan of salvation. And so I hold up those words to us today as we look at the roots of the church and the commission of the early church to spread the gospel throughout the world. So I remind you that we, on these couple of sessions this last week, on the video that talked about the foundations of the early church, looking through the eyes of the biblical account and biography of three of the great founders of the church, Peter and Paul and John. And we have, throughout the last last semester in the fall talked about the community of the beloved community of John's school, and we know a lot about it through the writings of the likes of Polycarp and Irenaeus and others who were a part of that school and a part of the worship of that section of the church. Most of what we know about the early church comes from the Acts of the Apostles, the writings of Paul and his epistles, and also some historical record, but not much. So what we're looking at is the inside-out view of the history of the founding of the church through these first three, primarily these three in the stories of the likes of Mark and Bartimaeus and others, Barnabas, and others who are attached with the mission work and the founding of the church. So we'll finish up with the first video, or the video that we started with last week, that talked first about Peter, and now we're finishing up with Paul, and just a very brief section about John's Gospel. And then we'll move to a time of a new video with N.T. Wright that I had mentioned, and I will hold off my remarks and intro to it until we come to it. So this is where we left off at the very tail of the work, the ministry of Paul.
To 2 Timothy and Titus. He was then once again arrested, and he was in fact put to death in Rome under Nero, probably about the same time that Peter was, and that would have been roughly 67 AD. So that's a very brief kind of chronology, as best we can piece it together of Paul, and I have taken about 5 minutes too long to do that, so I'm going to give you now very briefly all my apologies to the Apostle John for truncating this brief discussion of John, but let me just say a few things about him. He becomes a prominent apostle during this last period of time from 70 to 100. Jerusalem is destroyed in 70. The church is fully liberated from Jerusalem. The separation happened all during this time, but finally with Jerusalem's demise, the church becomes, as it were, her own body, and is no longer tied in any sense to a Jerusalem. It's no longer there. That's the reason. And John becomes, as it were, the great synthesizer of the last period of time. Now I'm going to, for you philosophers in the room, I'm going to get a little bit Hegelian on you here, because, watch out. But if you think of Peter as early Roman Catholic and Paul as early incipient Protestant, then there's clearly a little bit of tension between the two. And the theory has been that the great synthesis between that thesis and antithesis was John. John was the one who, in a sense, brought the church together, and there's some historical argument for it, that it was really under his regime, working as he did in Ephesus in those last years, that we find the church kind of finally getting on the same page, as it were, in a very, very difficult time early in our history. I've also heard it argued by some fairly astute church historians, to do a little bit of speculating here, that maybe that is a design for church history. That maybe in church history we have a time of Roman Catholic prominence, which we'll certainly see, and then we have a time of Protestant prominence, which we've seen, but maybe we're still awaiting a time of a great synthesis out there in the future. I don't know. I'm not going to hold that up as some kind of dogma, but it's an interesting hypothesis that at least would bear some examination. John himself, of course, is a quiet person. He is thoughtful, and yet he has this kind of heart of zeal that makes him also earn the title Son of Thunder from Jesus. You wouldn't expect that of this guy, but he's also born of his pure passion, the one that wanted to call fire down on a Samaritan village, and certain other things in his life that kind of give us that little flavor of him. Nevertheless, he has special prominence in the gospel accounts. He's the one to whom Jesus assigns the care of his mother when Jesus is there on the cross, and John was there with Mary. John actually married, the Virgin Mary was John's aunt. She was the sister of Salome, the mother thing he would say to them now as a final concluding remark, that was his final instruction before he died and ended his earthly time with us, was he would repeat over and over to those who gathered, "My little children, love one another. My little children, love one another." That's very Johannine. I really think that's probably true. John there in his latter days, this deep thinker, penetrating, musing analyst of the life of Christ, gives us the Gospel of John, the book of Revelation, all of these things. When it all came down to the final comment that he wanted to make, it was a good one for us. My little children, love one another. And so on that note, I will conclude my comments this morning.
Okay, I just want to point out a few things that we've learned. One is the timeline. Remember at the beginning of this particular video, he made a big point about thinking that the crucifixion had, in his earlier 2002 presentation of this, was at AD 30, but he's moved that back to AD 27. And through much of the 1900s, the 20th century, there was a thinking that John's Gospel came very late, like in the 90s or 100, even 110 CE. But since then, and what we've studied under the videos by John, the theologian, who wrote about the Gospel of John, whom we've quoted quite a bit, speaks of the book of Revelation being written before the destruction of the temple at AD 30, and even as early as the 50s or 60s, as well as the Gospel being written early as well. So before the destruction of the temple. So I wanted to point out that the sort of scholarly maybe contradiction or evolution of the understanding of the writing of John's Gospel and the book of Revelation, as he had pointed out, coming very late. Also wanted to point out, I think there's some confusion about John, the son of Zebedee, as a disciple, as opposed to John, the writer of the Gospel, who's spoken of in the Gospel, as being a separate disciple, not the one of the 12, or after the Judas Iscariot betrayal being 11, but he's yet another disciple, not of the calling of the sons of Zebedee. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, the son of thunder, and the other things titled. Now that comes from in the 300s and 400s, very late, as far as some of the writings of historians that have that thinking that the disciple is the same one who wrote the Bible. But John Bear, who wrote has studied all of these writings, early writings, was very clear that the early church accepted John, the writer of the gospel, as being a separate person than the son of Zebedee as a disciple of Christ called. So I wanted to point those two things out. And then Jerome, writing as he wrote very late in 345 to 420, writing back about sort of the stories and histories, a wonderful story. Yet I want to point out that Jerome was in the 300s and early 400s, much earlier than much later than all the other things we've been talking about, that John Bear has been talking about, which are the writings of the likes of Polycarp and Irenaeus, Ignatius, letters to Rome, and all of those types of things that came out of the community of John's Gospel. So, wonderful story. Love one another. My little children, paidion, that word in Greek that Jesus used. You have to have a faith like a little child in order to enter the kingdom of heaven. Here, a wonderful antidote for us, and love one another, and rings true to the words that Jesus said, if you love me, feed my sheep. If you love me, feed my sheep. If you love me, feed my sheep. So I wanted to point those things out, just kind of keep us on the same page.
How did they know that he grew old and said those phrases? Who wrote about that? That
Well, he said that came from Jerome. And that's why I pointed out it came very late. And it came from a certain fairly tradition
And they
or
wrote
writing.
it, they
And
wrote it down?
pardon?
They wrote it down?
Jerome wrote it down, but I don't know where he got it from. And that's, like I wanted to say, I don't want to disparage the history of that. But remember in the early church that many of the things that were attributed to John or to Paul or to Peter came a little bit later that were attributed to him, that were written down not by the primary source, but by followers, of speaking of, and sometimes pinned it under the name of that person, Peter, Paul, or John, as having said it, when actually we may not know because it was not. We don't see it in the early documents. Now, I don't know about this particular story, but it does help us to sort of illustrate the way in which the history has been handed down, that the words of those who came after the gospel writers were attributed to the gospel writers themselves, and that was very common in the Greek-Roman world, whereas a school of thought of a great teacher, those following would pin the name under that teacher's name as well. So I don't know that that's what happened in this particular case, but just to point out that that's more generally the way things were accepted.
Yeah.
They wouldn't make a big point of, well, is it that actual person historicity comes out of a sense like he has of this seems very Johannine in its content, but also in its way it's worded. So I want to transition to N.T. Wright and early Christianity in the Roman world. I want to preface it by saying that you'll have a little bit difference in the accent coming across with N.T. Wright, of course. And he speaks very quickly and a lot this time. So I'll be coming at you and very quickly, but also a wide variety of subjects. So I kind of want to warn you or put you in the mindset that this is like he's taking you through a smorgasbord of things. A lot of different tastes, a lot of different ideas, and that they come very quick, that he's kind of feeding it to you very quickly. So with that said, I think you'll gain out of what he's saying 2 or 3 very clear principles, particularly around the understanding of what life was like in the early centuries, and sort of the societal norms, what people held as being most important in life, and the ways in which they held those, and then the tensions that come up. So even though it's a smorgasbord of things, he kind of weaves it together in how this sort of the anthropological parts of this, how society was and what they held most important, affected the ways in which the faith of Christianity grew up in Roman culture out of the Jerusalem culture and the temple worship, and then how that affected the way in which the faith expanded, but also the diversity as we look, so the Jewish Christianity or the Greco-Christianity coming out of the last video of, as he spoke about, the Church in Rome being very Roman Catholic, the Church of John being, as we know, very universal, and it led to pulling the church together through the Nicene Creed and the understanding of Christology and the Trinitarian beliefs out of that school. But then also Paul's upbringing in his study of the Greek Roman gods, his understanding of philosophy and things of religion, of pagan religion, then gave him a step up in being able to, for lack of a better word, package or to present to the Gentiles a faith that then they could understand in a way of coming from their sense of values, their sense of world picture. We think about terms of the gods and the philosophy and the great ways of thinking that have gone through the generations. So, with that, it's a pretty long series of questions that are asked in this interview. If you have a question or thought, you just let me know and I'll stop the video and we'll discuss. And I also want to make sure that we have, with this, a good sound level. So help me out, make sure you can hear it fine. How can we picture daily life in the first
The first
century?
century BC was a very turbulent time in the Roman world, and the Roman authorities who were running the empire, which had swept around Eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, etc., as well as the West, were very concerned about anything that would be disruptive. And they had laws against people meeting in groups of more than just a handful. I was thinking about as I was flying on the aeroplane that they don't let you get together with 4 or 5 friends up near where you go through to the cockpit, because they're still frightened about 9/11, about conspiracy. And that's how it was in the Roman Empire, that they didn't want subversive elements getting together and plotting things behind closed doors. And that tells you something about security and that great motto that the Romans had, peace and security. Irenika Asphalia in Greek. I mean, I think in Greek because the eastern half of the empire and Paul's letters, of course, were in Greek. But that sense of Augustus has brought peace to the world, which simply meant that he was the last man standing after the civil wars. But that was really, really important because the Romans didn't do civil wars at home, they exported them. They had battles amongst themselves in parts of Greece or Turkey or wherever. And so the whole world knew what it meant to live in a world which was turbulent and people against one another. But then the whole idea of security, of being able to rely on everything working properly and normally and not having riots and so on, that's absolutely vital. And along with that, one which became very important under Augustus, though it's actually around in the Roman world before, but I think becomes a divinity under Augustus, is justice, justitia in Latin or dikaiosune in Greek. And these things are enormously important, that we Romans believe in justice and we export justice to the rest of the world who clearly needs it. So peace, security, justice, and in order to create a world in which these are possible, the word salvation is actually quite important. Salvation not in terms of what's going to happen to you after death, but in terms of putting things right that are at present wrong in society. Now, there are many others, but that's where I would start. We have a problem today in talking about ancient religion because the word religion has come in the last 3 centuries in Western Europe and North America to mean something quite different from what it meant. I mean, completely different. Because in the 1st century, religio were the things that bound you together as a community and bound you to the gods. Whereas since the 17th, 18th century in Europe and then in North America, religion by definition is something that happens in a different sphere to where the rest of society is. So you have politics and society here and religion over there. Now, that split is now quite under threat. I've just got back from America and discussing with friends there, they say, yeah, it really doesn't work anymore like we thought it did. But that's how the word religion, and things like departments of religion, they have studied the way that people behave in relation to a supposed non-terrestrial reality. Whereas in the 1st century, I mean, Cicero writes about religion. Actually, he writes about religions, plural, because for him, offering sacrifice to the gods is religion, that's an obligation, something which you are bound to do. Examining auspices before going into a battle, that's a religion. Consulting sacred oracles would be religion. And this is very, very confusing. So when we talk about ancient religion, we're always in danger of back projecting what we mean by religion into the ancient world. One of the scholars that I studied some years ago put it like this, that any given city or country had two sorts of inhabitants, the visible ones, the living human beings who are walking around, and the invisible ones, the gods and perhaps the ancestors, who were around, and they were important. They were part of the fabric of society. It's just you couldn't see them, but they needed to be kept on side. You needed to honour them, you needed to offer sacrifice, you needed to worship and offer prayers, etc., in order that the whole thing would somehow work together. And if bad things happened, if people found that there was a fire or a flood or whatever it was threatening the city, this would be because the proper religion had not been observed. Not religion in our sense, but drawing together the ordinary people who were around with the gods or the ancestors or whoever. So it's really difficult to talk about it in terms of what they believed then, because actually belief was not something that was particularly important. It was just assumed. The philosophers did push back at some of these things. I mean, people like Plutarch at the end of the 1st century saying, those old tales about the gods in Homer, we have to assume that gods aren't like that really. Therefore, Homer must be a book of allegories, and we have to decode the allegories. But if the philosophers were pushing back, that was perceived to be a bit dangerous. You might stop the ordinary people from doing what they ought to do, and then the gods would be angry. And so that's a world which is quite different from what most people in the modern Western world think of. So we need to rephrase our questions in the light of that distinction. Yeah, I mean, the Christians sort of overlap at certain points, so that if you imagine somebody who gained access to an early Christian meeting, they might recognise some of the things that the Christians were doing in terms of, oh, that's rather like what's going on in Mithras's shrine or whatever, particularly, for instance, the Eucharist being like a collective meal that people would have in honour of the God. And of course, famously then, baptism is not totally unlike some of the rituals of dying and being reborn. But in a sense, that's almost like a side issue, because what people would see if they were observing Christians and what they behaved, it would be more like a cross between a philosophical school, a political movement, a potentially dangerous political movement, and a synagogue. It's an odd combination perhaps to us, but I mean, for instance, in Mithras and the other religions so-called of the ancient world, they are not teaching you to think philosophically about God, the world, what humans are, etc. Whereas that's pretty important for Christians. And they're not teaching you what we call ethics either. If you want to know how to behave, you go in the ancient world, you go to a philosopher, you don't go to a priest in a shrine, because the priest in the shrine is doing whatever he's doing to offer sacrifice, and he will direct you to sacred oracles if you want, but that's not the way the Christians did it. So there are lots of dissimilarities. And of course the same is true for Jews in the ancient world. I mean, your synagogue at Ostia, in a sense it's easy for us to line that up alongside the temples and so on, but what's going on there is very, very different. They're not going and offering sacrifice, because that's what you would do in the temple in Jerusalem. And then, of course, in AD 70, the temple is destroyed, and then the synagogue community is basically a teaching place, a place where people go to pray, but they go to be taught Torah. There is no equivalent to that in the Roman world. You don't go to Mithras in order to hear texts being read and have somebody preaching on how you're to observe them. And so Christianity sits very awkwardly as something which is both like and unlike, and both recognisable and quite unrecognisable. People don't know what to do with it. It's a different thing. But at the centre of it is the early Christian basic claim. You see it in Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians. The fundamental thing about being a Christian is that you give up worshipping the gods. You turn from idols to serve a living and true God. So, yes, there are these idols. Everybody knows there are many so-called gods and lords. But we're not like that, because we are like the Jews who have the one God, even though then there are questions about who this one God is. But again, the sort of questions that nobody in the Greco-Roman world of religions, either in Ostia or Philippi or Athens or Rome, they weren't asking those sorts of questions. So the Christians are raising questions, and as everybody since Socrates knew, raising questions is dangerous. It subverts the status quo. There's a debate about to what extent, if any, Jewish teachers went around the non-Jewish world teaching people, recruiting people. There's the famous line in Matthew 23 where Jesus says to the Pharisees, "You cross land and see to make a single proselyte, and when you do so, you make him more of a child of Gehenna than you yourselves are." But many scholars have argued that actually there's not much evidence for that, of Jewish teachers going around and doing that, because what seems to have happened normally is that there were Jewish synagogues all over the place, except where there wasn't much of a Jewish community, like in Philippi, where there is a place of prayer, a proseuche, rather than an actual synagogue. But that then when people observed how the Jews were, how they behaved, how they looked after their own community, and how they didn't behave in the way that some pagans did, quite a lot of, well, what does quite a lot mean? But there were several non-Jewish people who would think, I'd like to belong to this community. And then they would discover that actually there are some big steps to be made if you want to become a full member. So there are lots of what they called God-fearers, who are the people who are around the edge of the synagogue community, who haven't become full Jews, but who are part of that whole way, and probably renouncing the gods themselves, though doing so rather privately and cautiously, lest their non-Jewish neighbours take offence. Because this is the thing, I mean, it's hard for us today to conjure up in our minds the atmosphere of an ancient pagan city, where many days of many weeks there would be processions going to somebody's shrine, there would be sacrifices being offered, there would be special festivals in honour of this or that or the other divinity, and you would be expected to show up. And whereas today, on a Sunday here in Oxford, quite a lot of people actually go to church, but most people don't. And if somebody doesn't go to church, then the other people in their church might realise that they were absent, but their neighbours wouldn't say, "Oh, they didn't go to church." Maybe 200 or 300 years ago, people might have done, 400 or 500 years ago. But that contrasts with how it was in the ancient world. People would know who wasn't doing their civic duty. And one of the key things is to remember that the priests in the cults were very often also the local magistrates, which made sense. They were the ones charged with keeping the peace in the local community and the peace between the visible and the invisible inhabitants of the city. So then the question of the synagogue is that we know that these Jews will not worship the gods. That's a done deal ever since the time of Julius Caesar and before. And many people in the non-Jewish world resented that, but the Jews were in other respects good citizens, or at least they taught one another to be good citizens. So that there was a sort of uneasy truce there. And then the question was, would the Christians be able to shelter under that umbrella or not? And that's a very interesting question, because in Corinth, according to Acts 18, the Roman proconsul Gallio said, "Oh, this Christianity thing, it's just an inner Jewish movement, and so it's nothing to see here, no concern of mine." The result is Christianity becomes legitimate in southern Greece on the same basis that the Jewish people are legitimate, which is both good and bad news, in that it means they're not persecuted, so the church can flourish and grow. But if you look at the Corinthian correspondence that Paul had, it's tricky when the church becomes suddenly legitimate and everyone floods in without really bothering whether they match up to the ideals or not. Paul has to say some sharp things to the Corinthian church, which he doesn't have to say to the others. So, but that's the sort of world we're talking about. And so if Christianity is trying to be like the synagogue, only for everybody, and without the entry requirement of circumcision, and without the food laws and the Sabbath keeping, well, this is a very odd thing. nobody knows what this movement is, so we suspect it's subversive, don't we? And when they start talking about Jesus as Kyrios and Soter, Lord and Saviour, oh my goodness, this is bad news. You know, him up the road is not going to be pleased. There's all sorts of things going on there which come to a head in certain points. One of the stories I love in the Gospels is when they show Jesus the tribute penny, the denarius from Tiberius, and Jesus says, whose is this image and superscription? And you know what the words around the edge are saying. Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus, Saviour, high priest. Here we are in the temple with Jesus, and the kind of multiple ironies of that are extraordinary. But I think that is a sort of a quintessential moment. But there's an extraordinary undesigned coincidence that Augustus, in the late years BC, so this is before the rise of Christianity, Augustus had got his court historian Livy and his court poets, people like Horace and Ovid, to write up splendidly about the great long story of Rome and how this long story of Rome had finally got to its fulfillment with the arrival of the great Augustus, under whose reign we now have peace and justice and security and all of that stuff. Now, exactly at the same time, but without deriving it from that Roman narrative, the Jews have a story which goes all the way back to Abraham, but which focuses particularly on passages like Daniel 9, which say that one day there is going to be a great turnaround and the Jewish people will be liberated, and Daniel 7 and Daniel 2, which go with Daniel 9, say that there is going to come a king or some sort of representative figure who will destroy the pagan empires and set up a kingdom which cannot be shaken. And I love that sort of sense of completely undesigned coincidences. The Jews are not getting that story from Rome, and the Romans aren't getting it from the Jews, but they both come to a head at the same time. And in both cases you have this figure who is both royal and divine somehow, we're not quite sure how. And so when the early Christians talk about Jesus as Kyrios, Lord, they are clearly getting that from, because they often quote the Psalms and Isaiah and so on. They're not getting it from the Caesar cult, though some scholars have tried to say they derived it from there. And I've in my work made the distinction between derivation and confrontation, that it seems to me clear that the Christians are consciously deriving what they say about Jesus from Isaiah, from the Psalms, from Genesis, from all over the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures. But it just so happens that some of the things they highlight, they must have known were quite literally on the coins and in the inscriptions around, and certainly the word Evangelion. When Paul uses the word Evangelion, good news, it seems to me clear that he is consciously echoing Isaiah chapter 40 and Isaiah chapter 52, which is all about the servant of the Lord who is going to defeat the pagans and restore Israel, and will extraordinarily in chapter 53 suffer and die in the process. You know, how Isaiah 53 is being interpreted is itself a good question in this period. But they must have known, because it was literally carved in stone around parts of the empire, that the people who were supporting Caesar, which was pretty well everybody, had the word Evangelion for the good news that we have an emperor who has brought justice and peace to the world. And so when I then read the early chapters of the letter to the Romans, particularly chapter 1, we have Jesus as the Son of God, who is the Lord of the world, through whom we have justice and peace and salvation. And you think, Paul, do you realise what you just said? And Paul is pretty savvy, he knows perfectly well what he just said. That all of this is derived from the Hebrew Scriptures, but confronting the Roman world. And how much that was picked up by Paul's first hearers, we can't say, but they're not stupid. You know, we sometimes have this myth that because we are post-Enlightenment people, we understand how literature works. No, they got it. They knew their myths, they knew their stories, etc. So I think there is an implicit confrontation. But of course, then you have the whole point that in the early Christian movement, there is a different way of being Lord. And when Paul and the others say that Jesus is Kyrios, this doesn't mean that he's going to rule in the same way that Augustus or Tiberius does. Jesus himself has that very famous passage in Mark 10 where he contrasts the way that pagan rulers rule by brute force and by bullying people with what he is doing, which is the Son of Man came to give his life a ransom for many. So he has not come to be served but to serve. So there is a contrast between two sorts of kingship, two sorts of lordship. In a sense, the church has spent the last 2,000 years trying to work that one out.
I just want to pause there a minute. That's a lot of stuff, right? Is it talking about the smorgasbord of things and questions coming to you, but also a lot to try to digest or eat in a short period of time. But N.T. Wright does such a wonderful way of making it understandable and presenting it, I think. But that last point, let's just reflect upon just for a minute a different way of being Lord than the world that's been shown in the likes of Augustus or Tiberius. Jesus came to show a different sort of lordship in the way in which he said this has been worked out for 2,000 years since then, and we're still kind of working through that. If you look through the history of the church, it has been early on persecuted, martyrs being put to death, and then became the religion of the Roman Empire, and then through the first millennia, the second millennia, you speak about the Crusades and the attempts to bring the world religion to be Christianity in the ways in which that was done by much of the church, and then also the way in which the church in Spain, particularly, the ways in which are trying to root out any sort of demons and misbeliefs and putting people to death and torturing people through that period as well. And finally, perhaps we felt like we were released from that in the days of the Enlightenment as we came through the rational thought of Kierkegaard and the others who talked about the rationality and reason. We kind of reasoned our way through that, but there's still that dynamic of power and amongst some parts of the church to be the dominant through power and through might, as opposed to what we might think of the other part of the church being more contemplative, being more at peace and at in a way more comfortable with the various other influences in the world that might impinge upon our Christian beliefs, or we say the beliefs of different denominations in different parts of the church as well, and the way that we respond to the outside or even inside influences of having a dominant faith or a dominant way of being Christian. And we look today to the use of Christianity in that way as well in our own country among some. So I just wanted to point that out, that he kind of just leaves that hanging, that we're worked out for the next 2,000 years, that we're still working that out about the lordship of Christ and what that means, and if it's the Christian army going forth in victory, how's that victory won or been won? It still becomes a big question that I think we're in conversation with in different denominations and different parts of those who claim the Christian faith.
I think it's one of the major contrasts between the Jewish world and the Christian world on the one hand, and the ancient non-Jewish Christian world, that the non-Jewish world had things like the Sibylline oracles, they had things like the Delphic oracles, and some things were written down like the Sibyllines, and some you had to go to Delphi and ask a question, and and get a nice answer in hexameters from the priestess at the shrine at Delphi. They told the non-Jewish, non-Christian people, I'm trying not to use the word pagan because that's controversial, but you know what I mean. They have stories about the ancient world which merge into what we called, and sometimes they called, myth. But those myths aren't just as important, the myths of Romulus and Remus or the great Homeric myths, etc. So that you could allude to them and everybody knew what you were talking about. Just like I've observed with my own students, if you allude to something that happened in one of the television soap operas the previous week, everybody knows what was going on, what the motivation was, what the outcome was, etc. In the same way, people in that world lived in that world of myths, of the Orestes myth, of all sorts of things. So that, in a sense, functioned as their Old Testament, but not in the same way that the Jewish Old Testament functioned, because this was a real story about real people, that as it came forward into the present time, particularly since the Babylonian exile, this was about things like the Maccabees who had been martyred for their refusal to take part in pagan ritual, etc. And the Jews of the first century, as we know from Josephus, were absolutely determined, we're going to be loyal to those traditions. So the traditions which are then there in the scriptures are coming forward, comprising a 2,000-year story to which we are the heirs and to which we have to be loyal. And so when the early Christians pick that up, this becomes one of the great problems. And you see in Justin Martyr in the 2nd century, to whom do the scriptures really belong? Are they actually the Jews who will then say that you Christians have veered off and gone off in a wrong direction? Or are they actually fulfilled in Jesus? And if so, how do you know, and what does that mean, and how do we then navigate that tension? But all that's going on, as Gallio said in Corinth, as a kind of inner Jewish question, but it's a puzzlingly inner Jewish question in that the Christians, by definition, are not becoming Jews, and that's the problem in Galatians, that there are some who think they better just for the sake of peace and quiet. And Paul is saying, no, that's to miss the point. And so, at the heart of it all, you have the figure of Jesus. And Jesus remains a very disturbing figure throughout the 1st and 2nd centuries and thereafter. But there we have this very strange phenomenon, which is that the language that they use about Jesus is very similar to things that in the Old Testament are said about Israel's relationship with Yahweh, including Yahweh as bridegroom and Israel as bride, and so Jesus now and his bride, the church, and so on, which is a theme you find in different bits of the Old Testament. And this is telling us that Jesus is both a very striking and interesting and challenging figure of recent memory and a figure that people can get to know personally in the present. And I think that's what sets the early Christians apart, a sense of Jesus as a living presence. Now, it may be that some devotees of Mithras would say, well, we sense Mithras as a living presence, but I don't think they did in the same way. And likewise, people who were part of the imperial cult, which was the fastest growing so-called religion of the time, they maybe felt Augustus or Tiberius or Nero or whoever as a living presence, and as his face was on the coins, it greeted them wherever they went. But I think, when they went back home and lay down at night, they didn't have a sense of the emperor being personally present with them. And then we might come further on to this, and all that meant in terms of a reorientation of their deepest personality, who they were, their families and their community as well as themselves. In a way, it must have been perceived by some at least as a parallel with the Roman Empire. Now that Augustus or whoever has become emperor, his heralds need to go out and tell the world, Augustus is emperor, so pay the tax, and if you don't, it'll be worse for you, sort of thing. Now, Jesus is Lord, therefore sign on, join in. and the results are very different from Augustus, but there is a sense of a global perspective. But that itself goes back to the Old Testament. I mean, one of the links which hasn't always been made, but should be, is that the second psalm, which is very popular in the early church, is a kind of universalizing of the promise to Abraham. Abraham is told, I will give you a family and I will give you a land. And the same language of inheritance and so on is used in Psalm 2 to the Davidic king, ask of me and I will give you the nations for your inheritance and the uttermost parts of the world for your possession. And some Jewish thinkers of the first century, Philo of Alexandria being an example, saw that as a mandate for the Jewish people to become influential and to spread the news of the true God and perhaps true ways of behaving around the rest of the world. And Philo talks grandly about that there are Jews in every country of the world and their influence is being felt, kind of thing. I'm broadly summarising here, but that's part of that same sense. And this, of course, is part of the monotheistic imperative, that if there is one God, and if Israel is God's people, then maybe this one God has worldwide purposes of some sort through the Jewish people. And then the Christians focus that Jewish identity onto Jesus, believing him to be Messiah. And that's a hugely important thing, which I don't think has a parallel in the same way anywhere in the Greco-Roman world, of the destiny of one whole nation or people landing up on one person, the one who is now the Anointed One, the Mashiach, and that therefore through him the promises to Abraham are fulfilled, that all the families of the earth will be blessed. And Paul minds that scene very deeply, and that's the presupposition behind the four Gospels as well, in all sorts of ways. We're telling this great story from Adam and Abraham and so on, all the way through. It's focused on Jesus, but now, yes, go into all the world. And the end of Matthew's Gospel, same as the end of Luke's Gospel, you have what people have called the Great Commission. But it is based on the fact that Jesus is now hailed as the universal sovereign, which is bound to, it cannot but be counter-imperial, it must be counter-imperial. So it is in a sense the translation of that still rather vague Jewish expectation, because for many Jews in the first century, the point is not, are we going to be running the world? The point is, are we going to be rescued from the people who are at present running the world? But Philo, sitting there as a philosopher in Alexandria, though that was uncomfortable sometimes too, could have this global vision, and it's that same global vision that you find in Christianity. But you don't find that in the pagan cults. I mean, there's no sort of sense of, okay, we've established a good shrine to whichever god it is here, now we've got to go out and establish that elsewhere. No, if people want to come to a shrine of Asclepius, well, they know where that is, they can find out, they can make the journey, stay in an inn and come and sleep overnight in Asclepius' shrine and hope that they'll be healed. But it's not the same way, it doesn't have that same missionary imperative. Yeah, I'm not sure that it necessarily is, because it is first of all perceived as subversive and as socially dangerous, both because it seems to be undermining the Caesar cult. I mean, it's not in Philippi, it's in Thessalonica in Acts 17, where they're accused of saying there is another king, namely Jesus. That's bad news. Thessalonica and Philippi are not that far from Rome, about a quick sea passage and then along the main road. But the attractiveness, I think, comes as with people aware of a Jewish community. These people are living in a different way. They seem to have a different, what we would call a different ethic. They care for one another. They have quite a strong sexual ethic, which to many people, especially women in the ancient world, accustomed to all kinds of murky goings on. This was really appealing. Wow, maybe there is another way of life. Maybe you can order your life like that. They were supposedly straightforward in their business dealings, etc., so they weren't cheating and lying and so on all the time. So people respected that, but it took time for that to bed in and for people to realise that that was so. But as they did, then there was a sense of attraction. But I think to begin with, that was not there. Things were very confusing. And obviously, to begin with, in Philippi, there Paul and Co are perceived as a thorough nuisance. But then you have an earthquake and the walls fall down and so on, a dramatic scene. Yes, I would broadly agree on that. I was reading somebody the other day, and I can't remember who it was, but it seems an obvious point, but it isn't always made in this context, that in the ancient world, whatever you believed about the gods, nobody ever said that either Zeus or Athene or any of that lot actually loved you. That they, Athene, you had to go and worship. If you were in Athens, you had to go to a shrine. You had to pay homage to the gods. And the gods, you might be able to bring them on side and persuade them to support your plans or whatever. But any idea that they loved you and were wanting you to be part of their family and so on, this is quite alien and different. The only people who have a God who loves them are the Jewish people. And so the idea, going back to Deuteronomy and so on, of the love of God comes through very strongly in Christianity. The idea of there being a God who loves you, which is there in the Jewish world, all the way back through the Psalms and Isaiah to Deuteronomy and so on, this is something you just don't find in the ancient pagan world. But it comes then through into Christianity, particularly through the figure of Jesus himself. When Paul says in Galatians 2, the Son of God loved me and gave himself for me, you don't find parallels to that in the mystery religions and so on. You may be able to find your way into the mystery of Mithras, but there's no sense that Mithras actually has come looking for you and embraced you in love. And then the way that this works is that it's not just an idea, it's then lived out by the actual people themselves. Famously 200 years later, Tertullian is saying that people are saying, look how they love one another, that the Christians cared for one another. This is why church disunity is such a scandal and such a sorrow, that actually it's one of the marks of the Christian church from its earliest days. And you can see this because one of the first controversies in Acts is that they have to figure out there's a slippage in the distribution of food to the widows who are part of their community. And people say, what an odd thing for Luke to highlight. And the answer is no. This shows that they're already living as family within the first decade. And that's one of the meanings of the word agape, love. When Paul says to the Thessalonians, I know that you already love one another, I want you to do so more and more. He doesn't mean, I know you already have warm, fuzzy feelings about one another, I want you to have even warmer, even fuzzier feelings about one another. He means, I know that you're already taking care to look after the poor in your midst and on the fringes, and I want you to put even more effort into doing that, because agape is something you do basically with your whole self, but not least your money. And so the idea of there being a God, just one God, and this one God who's the world's creator, loves you personally, this is a whole new idea. And when they discover that it's true, because here's a community that's actually doing it and living like that and see it works, and then when you say, well, how does that happen? They talk about Jesus. And so Paul says, the Son of God loved me and gave himself for me. John says, when Jesus, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them, eis telos in Greek, which means the last thing love could do, he did. He did everything that love could do for them. This is, again, something which you don't find in the other traditions. And I think when we've been discussing this as scholars, we've rather backed off from that, as though that seems to be a declining away from hard sociological analysis and just wandering off into pietism. But actually, when you see the impact that the early Christian communities have, and the reason why, despite persecution, people want to join in, is that this is something that they sense is what we might call humanizing or rehumanizing, as opposed to dehumanizing, which is so much the way that so much was. And I think that has to be factored into the whole picture. And of course, again, Jesus is absolutely central to that. And when you look at the stories in the Gospels, and it's one of the problems about the way that we've talked about Christology, talked grandly about who Jesus was perceived to be. If you could come forward 3 or 4 centuries, They're inventing formulae about him being totally inhuman and totally divine, etc., etc. But in those formulae, what you miss is the kind of quizzical, friendly, challenging, inquiring, healing, disturbing presence that you find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so they're telling those Jesus stories which make very personal and very real the big story about a creator God who loves you and the world, and the visible story of a community that is loving one another in a costly way. And when asked why, they say, well, we follow this man Jesus. And that's the big difference, it seems to me. And you can't map that onto the other figures in the ancient world. You know, there may be some loose analogies, but this is a major theme in Christianity, and I think it's one of the major things that sets it apart.
All right, we're right at the end of time, but that last piece I think was very, very rich in its presentation, the way in which it contrasts the early community of the church compared to the religious of the pagan, and also the other ways of thinking and doing, and the ways in which we think about perhaps getting back to our roots has to do with some of the way in which we show love to each other as an entree to the way that we then can talk about Jesus and the presence of Jesus, and that we have a God that loves us that is much different than what a lot of certainly makes a contrast to the ancient religions, not offering that in the pagan religions, but also in our own day and time. So just leave that thought with you as we go forward from here. We'll finish out this a little bit, and then we'll move on to speaking about the ways in which this then crystallized into the Nicene Creed, the beliefs of who this Jesus is, and the fights that went on with him. So, thank you all for being here. Thank you. How long, how many weeks since it came? Until spring. What we will do as the Christian formation. So on Sunday morning, we'll have all this as well. We'll continue to have this. Well, until April, actually.
We're gonna have to miss.
Oh, okay.
I keep having appointments until late. So if you have any problems, I might be.
Oh, my gosh, it's always house by the wall.
Right. So, but we won't be, but I just wonder how, so till late.
Yeah, and we'll continue to post these things and for people online as well.
Okay.
If you're
All right.
interested in that.
All right, thank you.
Be well.
Enjoy.
Very well done. Thank you.
Will you go ahead and go in?